Welcome to Elixir Mix, your weekly Elixir podcast talking with members of the community. My name is Mark Ericksen, and today we have Josh Adams.
Hey!
And Michael Ries.
Hello, Elixir friends.
This episode is sponsored by Sentry.io. Recently, I came across a great tool for tracking and monitoring problems in my apps. Then I asked them if they wanted to sponsor the show and allow me to share my experience with you. Sentry provides a terrific interface for keeping track of what's going on with my app. It also tracks releases so I can tell if what I deployed makes things better or worse. They give full stack traces and as much information as possible about the situation when the error occurred to help you track down the errors. Plus, one thing I love, you can customize the context provided by Sentry. So, if you're looking for specific information about the request, you can provide it. It automatically scrubs passwords and secure information, and you can customize the scrubbing as well. Finally, it has a user feedback system built in that you can use to get information from your users. Oh, and I also love that they support open source to the point where they actually open sourced Sentry if you want to self-host it. Use the code devchat at Sentry.io to get 2 months free on Sentry's small plan. That's code devchat at Sentry.io.
So today we wanted to just talk together and have a conversation about some different topics that we've been having, and just offline, off the podcast. We just still communicate. We have ideas and things, and there's some topics that we want to just kind of cover. And some of those, so we're going to touch on a few different things, but we thought we'd get started with some discussions that I've seen around in the Elixir community recently, because one of the things that I think is exciting about the Elixir community is that we have a lot of new people coming in from a lot of different areas. Originally, in the early days of Elixir, it seemed like pretty much everyone was coming from Ruby on Rails kind of background. And now, I'm talking with people who are coming out of JavaScript boot camps. And when someone gives an explanation of something like, oh, it works just like this in Rails, they're like, I have no idea what that means. That doesn't help me. And then we have other people who are coming out of longtime PHP developers or Java developers. So I think it's awesome that we have reached this point in the Elixir's growth that we are drawing people from all these different communities. So some of the interesting topics that we can kind of cover there that I'd love to hear everyone's opinions on is kind of like with language adoption. Whenever there's a new language, like right now, we seem to be kind of in a language renaissance, right? There's a lot of languages that have been coming out, like Go, and what is the new Apple one that I keep forgetting about? Swift, yes, thank you. And, there's Clojure, and, it's not terribly new, but it's still in that growth cycle. There's a lot of different languages, a lot of Rust, a lot of different options. What's that?
Pony?
You'll have to tell me about that one. I didn't even know that one.
Yeah, it was birthed from Erlang community members, which is fun. And then, And then Crystal.
Yep.
Lots of fun languages.
Yeah, so it's kind of this renaissance where people are exploring new ideas. And so some of the concerns I've kind of heard expressed are people saying like, oh, I'm someone, or I know people who are really excited about Elixir and they want to be doing Elixir development, but they can't find jobs. And it's just kind of like that concern about where we are in the growth cycle and thinking, oh, there aren't jobs. So I'd love to hear you guys' thoughts on that perspective and just kind of where you see Elixir currently in its growth.
Just before diving in to answer that question, I wanted to mention one other language actually that I heard about recently that sounded very interesting because it's very different than all the other ones we mentioned. So it's called Dark or Darklang. And I think I'm not going to do this justice, but I'll say that one of their main hypotheses is actually that any sort of new technologies tend to go through expansion and contraction phases. And expansion phases, you can think of these as like, when PCs are new, people are just inventing random one-off programs. All programs kind of live independently. And then someone realizes like, oh, there's kind of like everyone who works a desk job, they all use spreadsheets, they all use word processing. We're going to make Microsoft Office. And now there's like a condensation phase where a bunch of ideas get pulled back together, and you can tie a bunch of the layers. You can kind of collapse a bunch of the layers of abstraction and help users not have to think about them. And Darklang very much tries to do that for programming languages. So it has its own deployment and hosting story. There's literally no way that you can deploy this code on your own, as far as I'm aware. And so you write it, it has its own editor. And so like, you don't have to choose an editor. You don't have to choose a package manager. You don't have to choose how to deploy it. You don't have to choose where to run it. All those choices are made for you, which is both good and bad. But it's a very interesting and different set of trade-offs. So just as we're talking about language life cycles, maybe this is one at least I'm keeping my eye on just to see its story will unfold very differently than Elixir's story is going to unfold, which will be interesting to me. I think back to your question more directly than Mark, I kind of think of, I think there's kinds of two graphs that pop into my mind when we talk about adoption of languages. One is an adoption curve that talks about early adopters, the early majority, late majority, laggards. I just dropped a link and in our show notes. And so that one talks a lot about kind of the personas that get interested at different times. But there's another graph that popped into my mind called the hype cycle. And the hype cycle is a little bit more about the way people feel about new technologies. And to some degree, both industries and individuals go through the hype cycle with each new technology. So I think I can see people's point in saying that it's hard to find Elixir jobs. Interestingly, I live in a spot where I think that's actually not very true. There's several large-ish Elixir companies that live in my area or that operate in my area, and they have been hoovering up developers from other communities. I know people who hire Ruby developers in the area where I live are all complaining because a bunch of those Ruby developers are getting hoovered up by the Elixir, a couple of the big Elixir companies. Which is, for me, that's extremely exciting to see. But I mean, I can understand why it causes other people some consternation. And I have definitely seen, though, that there's a lot of communities where there is no big Elixir shop in town, or your only real shot is going to be to try to work remote. And there's lots of people who may or may not want to work remote for reasons totally separate of the language choice, just because of the way they like to work and the way they like to interact with their coworkers.
Yeah, to that end, I would just reiterate that if you're willing to do remote work, and I very much prefer it, then it's much easier to sort of be at the cutting edge on the language side of things, because the companies that are also cutting edge have to take people where they can get them, and very frequently that is remote. So early in the adoption cycle, I feel like it's easier to get a job remotely by leaps and bounds. Having said that, here in my tiny major metro, so I'm near Birmingham, Alabama. There are multiple Elixir companies hiring right now, so there's more jobs than there are people to fill them, and it's a smaller metro.
That's interesting. I used to live outside of the Birmingham area and work in Birmingham, and at that time, that was it was too long ago to say, but it was a .NET Microsoft town. So
it's still primarily a .NET Microsoft town.
But it's interesting that there's Elixir at all. Because like when I was there, I was looking to try and do Rails development, and there was one company doing questionable things, and I was like, I can't work for them. But so they're like, they were like creating, like bank cards for with really high, aggressive interest rates, targeting the people who really have horrible credit. It's like I can't be a part of that. So I had to move. I had to move to where I felt like it was a good market. But that was something I was willing to do. Not everyone can do that. I totally get that too.
So work remote and give up your ethics. Those are the two the two pro tips so far. I think so. That's interesting to hear your comment on working at a .NET place, trying to advocate for Ruby. I was working at a PHP shop. Kind of right out of college. Well, during college, I got like an hourly job and ended up getting a full-time job with a company that was doing a lot of PHP. And during that time, we were constantly fighting the churn cycle of bugs. Like every time we release a new feature, we'd break something, like inevitably, every single time. And so I started like looking into testing and other things. And that's kind of when I started to fall in love with Ruby at the time. And I was really advocating for Ruby. And I remember going through a period feeling super frustrated that like, man, there's like not only my company, but there's all these other companies in my area where, if they had better unit tests and if they were in a community that valued unit tests so that they would find other developers for their team that valued unit tests, things could be so much better. And so I think it's healthy that as a community, like if you are in a spot where you're feeling frustrated that you can't find Elixir work when you want to, to be aware that you're not alone. There's a lot of people for a lot of different languages that have felt that way or that will be feeling that way because they see some way that this new tool would serve their team, their product, their users better. And making the jump from seeing a way that it makes things better to actually being able to do the thing that makes things better, that's actually quite a wide chasm. It requires a large leap, not only for you, but for teammates, for the people who have invested money into your company, potentially, other people at the company who have invested their time into that company and that product. You're asking a lot of people to make a leap. So I think, just having patience, being willing to do a lot of the slow work of getting other people on board with the decision and with finding a way that you can slide into that new world of using a tool that makes something better.
Yep. I wanted to just kind of give some perspective and share like my story kind of coming to Ruby on Rails, because I was like in .NET and because that was the best that I knew at the time and I was excited about it. And then, I was doing web development, and this is pre MVC framework even in .NET. This is back with web forms. And that's all that existed, right? That was the solution. It's like, this is how you do web development with ASP web forms. And I thought, okay, well, I get it. That makes sense. And then I started playing with Ruby on Rails because it was a very new technology, very just kind of starting to pick up on the hype cycle. I was like, this is such a better way to do this. Like the MVC model, the way of organizing code, the way you're actually generating just straight up controlled HTML and JavaScript, and it's like more web standard compliant, and everything about it was better, at least from the perspective I had. And then I went through that phase. Being an early adopter, I went through that phase of like trying to get adoption in my company, trying to find places where I could reach out and be with other people, like either online communities or meetups or anything like that, just trying to find people who are interested, trying to find other jobs. So I've been through that cycle and I recognize what that feels like. And I see the same pattern here in Elixir. So I just want to kind of reassure people who may be in that point of, Elixir's been around now for, I don't remember, Jose was telling us, I think it was maybe 5 years now, maybe 7 years. I'm not sure.
Yeah, a little over 5 years in its current incarnation.
Yeah. So it's about 5 years old, right? And that's actually been around for a while. Like when you look at the technology curve, like it was, you, Josh and Michael, and we kind of were some of those earlier adopters. And so we've, been working with it for 4 years or so. And so we're at a different place in our personal development experience with this language. And so I just want to reassure people that if they are concerned about that and they're kind of coming fresh now and they're excited about the technology, that this is a known kind of cycle, and it does take time to really pick up and become really mainstream. Like right now, I would say Rails is mainstream. There are a number of different coding boot camps or ways to just learn Rails, and they'll just kind of keep turning out more people that have learned Rails. And so that is, I'd say, the definition of mainstream. And so it is going to, at some point, start to wane and drop off. Like if you look at Cobalt, right? I took in some computer science classes back in college. I lived in a town where one of the big businesses was a bank back end, like First Data is what they're called, big bank systems, big mainframes, and we'd go tour it, and they'd have big robot arms that would be in these silos and go pick out tape cartridges and load them and run credit card jobs and all that kind of stuff. And they were pushing for people to learn COBOL because they needed people to maintain systems. But COBOL is still around. You can still do COBOL, but it is on that way sliding down phase. But it is one of those things that will be around for a long, long time.
Yeah, often when a technology is on the way sliding down phase, the salaries for people that will still work in it are outsized, which is maybe a benefit.
Yeah.
You can make a lot of money doing COBOL these days.
Yeah, just because there aren't that many people who can do it. Yeah, so I don't know. It's just kind of, I just wanted to help people get a little bit of perspective about like, if you're coming new to development, like you haven't been programming for very long, maybe you're like a junior or even coming up to mid-level in your career, you're still fairly early in the kind of whole grand scheme of it. And that's an awesome place to be. It's exciting. It's fun. There's lots to learn, but it's just kind of get a bigger picture. It's like these cycles have existed. They will continue to exist, be it with Elixir or Swift or anything. There's going to be different languages will achieve different levels of success and adoption and become different levels of mainstream. And then eventually there will be supplanted by something else eventually, right?
One thing I think is interesting is I feel like containerization has compressed a little bit the ramp up for languages because it's much more palatable to bring a new language in when it's just a container that your ops guys already know how to deploy. Whereas back at the beginning of Rails, figuring out how to deploy stuff pre-Capistrano even was interesting to say the least. And you certainly couldn't just hand it over to existing ops people and expect them to go do it.
Totally. And then I'd had situations where you're trying to migrate from one version of Rails or, Ruby to another version, and you have like maybe multiple applications. So you have to roll out a new, virtual machine or hardware because conflicting libraries and everything. So yeah, you're right. Containerization really has been an interesting way to compress some of those changes.
That's it. I hadn't thought about containerization in that, but I have noticed that it has been a general trend that there are some life cycles we've seen in the recent years that I would say are condensed, right? So if you think about, Go, when it released, so it released in, I think, like 2012. So it's been around like a couple years longer than Elixir, but its adoption at this point is much higher. And that's affected by a lot of different factors, not least of which is being backed by Google and having the creator, maintainer of the language, like the core team being completely sponsored by Google. And that then creates buzz, which creates a bunch of people trying it out, that creates traction, and companies are, when they know Google's using it, then it's considered stable. So companies are less risk averse about it. So, we see those kinds of stories. JavaScript is an interesting one because it had this long history, but went through another hype cycle, I'd say, with all of the Node.js and then NPM, tooling that kind of repopularized, at least it created new ways of building interesting JavaScript things and then single page apps and all that. So there's all these different factors that I think a language can go through multiple hype cycles. And this actually reminds me, I'll drop a link here to Fred Hebert wrote a blog post recently called 10 Years of Erlang. And he talks about how Erlang had a very interesting hype cycle where there was a little bit of buzz around it right around the time that Ericksen open sourced it. Before that, there was kind of like rumors about it. I remember in college hearing stories about an Erlang system that was at a telco, and it was discovered years later that someone had hot reloaded a module that allowed them to basically wiretap certain conversations. And they had gone, like, this hack was really elaborate, they had like found ways to make sure that the MD5 sum of the new bytecode matched the MD5 of the original. It was like really, really obviously extremely highly, I don't want to give a positive adjective here. It was extremely well done for what it was.
Very, very clever. Yes.
Very clever. There you go. And so I heard about that kind of stuff, but Erlang really wasn't a language that I knew of as like a real thing that people delivered software with. And Fred talks about how, a lot of companies during these time periods, Erlang found its way into like Cisco. It found its way into a lot of these infrastructure places. So, the routing layer at Heroku was, I think that one is still on Erlang. Facebook's chat system for a while was on Erlang. And so when it got open source, it kind of went through a hype cycle, but it found its way very much into the world of infrastructure, kind of lower level components that people would build systems on top of. So think of, RabbitMQ kind of fits into that storyline as well. But there weren't a lot of end products built on Erlang. And when Elixir comes along, we're in an interesting spot because we share all the history and the stability of Erlang. And so, we say like Elixir is 5 years old, but the VM is obviously much older than that. It has decades of sponsored research into it. And that creates a bunch of stability that if the whole ecosystem was 5 years old, it just wouldn't be there. Even Phoenix, like if it couldn't have been built on Cowboy, it wouldn't have had, those microsecond response times in its early versions. And so we benefit from certain things that help our hype cycle, but we also, our hype cycle will look different. And I would say that it's a fairly good bet. In my opinion, I think it's a fairly good bet that our hype cycle won't look like Go and our hype cycle won't look like JavaScript. And so I don't imagine, that the number of Elixir programmers is ever going to be larger than the number of people doing Go on a daily basis for work. But that also doesn't matter to some point. It doesn't matter whether or not 50% of the world is using Elixir. It just matters that there's enough people using it and enough companies with a vested interest that its future is going to be fairly stable. And I think it's even worth noting that like the most advanced age use case we've talked about so far of Cobalt, it is still around, right? Like, no, I don't know of any projects that are starting today where someone's like, oh, let's use Cobalt. But even though it's really on the tail end of its life cycle, there's no sign of it going away because there's so many systems that exist. And even though lots of new software is being written all the time, there's a lot of software that just continues to run and continues to work, and people don't want to rewrite it. And they're just going to do whatever it takes to have another Cobalt and another mainframe, and someone will keep building mainframes because there's a market to sell them. So, I don't think we know a whole lot as an industry about what the end of that life cycle looks like, other than the fact that it drags on a lot further than most people would have guessed.
I think it actually drags on basically indefinitely. There's a book I've forgotten the name of by Kevin Kelly, where he just goes over just the history of technology generally. And he just goes through a ridiculous number of extremely ancient technologies that you would think for sure have been superseded. And then he's like, here's where it's used in industry today.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's go ahead and get some estimates then. Based on the technology adoption lifecycle curve that you posted, where do we think each of us that Elixir is right now? I believe that we're still in like the late phase of early adopters, personally.
Yeah, that's interesting because I also think of myself just in terms of my own experience with the hype cycle. So I'm glad you included that one, Michael. But like the hype cycle, I remember. So I will come back to that, Josh. I do want to make sure I weigh in on that and like give Michael a chance to do that. But I think of the hype cycle. I think I remember when I first started learning about Elixir, and compared to what I knew with Ruby on Rails and .NET and other languages, it's like it's like, oh, this can solve all the problems. This can solve this. This will be everything. Like look at Bleacher Report, how they went from 150 Rails servers down to 5, and they were over provisioned with that. It's like this can do everything, right? Going from that to having basically unrealistic expectations, right? And on the hype cycle, that is the peak of inflated expectations. And then you drop down into what they call the Trough of Disillusionment. And I don't think I ever really hit that, like in terms of like, oh, this can't do anything.
First time I tried to deploy something is when I hit that.
Right. Yeah, it's like, oh, I can't build a 3D game engine with this. It's like, okay, yeah, maybe not. But, so it is just the recognition that there is appropriate jobs where different technologies excel. And then you have the slope of enlightenment. It's like, okay, I see what problems this technology is really good at. And then you have the plateau of productivity, which is just like, okay, I'm productive. I'm getting stuff done, making meaningful change. So I went through that personal journey myself. I do kind of feel like we are and a lot of it is geographic. Like you're talking about, like Michael, like where we live. Like Michael and I both live in Utah. And so there are a lot of opportunities here. And so I do think a lot of it is geographic. Like, there might not be as much on, in Birmingham or on the East Coast or, I don't know, Austin. I haven't been looking around for jobs to know what it's like. But I think it will be different in different places. But I kind of do feel like we are still in that early adopter phase. It is not.
the only reason I got to be an early adopter basically is because I ran a consultancy. So I got to pick what I wrote stuff in for the most part, if it wasn't, pushed on me by a particular client. And so when I started learning about it, I didn't have to stop there. I actually got to use it in production because I wanted to. And most people don't really have that freedom. And that's a shame.
Yeah. So I don't know. My vote is still in the early adopter phase. Michael, what about you?
I think I agree. It does, to me, I'd say it feels like the latter end of the early adopter phase, because, at this point, if you ask the question like, oh, which notable companies are using Elixir in production, it's not going to be like one or two or three. It's there's quite a few at this point that are using it. So that feels to me like we're moving out of early adopters and into people who are like, no, we're going to be reliably delivering value based on this. Obviously, I think it's still in the earlier stages of that, right? Like, and probably not really even there. So I definitely don't think it's in its early majority. I think it's definitely it's still in the early adopters phase. One thing that I think is really interesting and worth noting to me, though, as I've kind of, gone similar to Mark, kind of gone through my own cycle of, oh my gosh, I just want to use Elixir for everything, literally feeling like every piece of code I have written in the last 10 years would have been better in Elixir. I remember saying that at lunch to a friend. And you could maybe say that that's peak hype. And so, coming off of that to like, having gone through watching a team of people try to get on board with it. We built a project. I had advocated for it. We got kind of the sign off like, yep, you can go ahead and build. And what we'd like you to do is try to pull 2 new people into that project, let them learn Elixir and see how they feel about it at the end of their learning phase. And what we found is that a couple new people that kind of got pulled in, three people ended up new people ended up contributing besides the 2 original authors. One had kind of played around with Elixir before, and that person really loved it. And, they were up to speed within a week and making meaningful contributions. The other 2 people had not done any Elixir before. One of them, both of them took about 2 weeks, I would say. Like in the first week, there was a lot of like, wait, what the heck is pattern matching? That takes some conversations. Then there's like hey, how come if I enum.each things, I can't actually make any changes? And that's like, okay, immutable data structures conversation. There's like a few of those classic ones you have to have when people are coming up to speed on Elixir. And those tended to happen in the first week. And then the second week was a lot more of like, oh, I need to go look at the Phoenix docs for each little thing I want to do, or I need to go look at the Elixir docs to find the function that does this thing. But within, I'd say 2 weeks, both of them had made, they had PRs open that were significant, right? They were making meaningful change to the project. And one of them at the end had a really positive review of the experience. And the other one was kind of, meh, like after doing that much work, I would just as happily do it in Ruby. And so, I think that kind of tempered my excitement a little bit, realizing like, oh, not everyone will love this thing the same way that I love it. But that being said, there is also evidence that like there's certain things that Erlang and Elixir community are getting right that really are still missing in other tool sets. And one that stood out to me, we've talked a lot recently about Gary Bernhardt. And I noticed he had a tweet the other day, and he was talking about a product that he recently was like working on quietly, and then he just released it. And he talks about trying to monitor processes, and that he used like systemd. He tried out a bunch of different kind of off the shelf tooling to basically be able to make a tree of different processes that might depend on each other. These are operating system level processes. And then making sure that things got restarted when different things crashed. And he basically has this like half rage tweet of literally all of them had edge cases that I could find in a trivial amount of experimentation, which is exactly my same experience. Like if I think still on like systemd, if a process hard crashes, like it just seg faults, it just will end up in some zombie state where the PID file is still there and it doesn't know if it's still alive or whatever. And it won't ever self-heal. And that kind of stuff, there are lots of examples of Erlang and Elixir systems that got supervision right and ran for years and years and years without ever having something get into a zombie state. Not that that can't happen, you can do it, but the tooling around it is so much better. And I think it's one of these reasons that you'll see people who went far enough in that cycle to start to really understand what's happening inside of OTP. I see a very low drop-off rate of those people. Because once they've seen that, even if they switch and like, oh, I want to take this job that's interesting to me and it's not in Erlang, they'll walk away from the community for a little bit to do a job or whatever, but they are anxious to come back when the opportunity presents itself, because the observability tools, the stability and reliability tools are just the best that I've found anywhere. And I think we should, keep that in mind, just at least when I'm doing my mental calculations of, yes, we're in the early adopter phase. Yes, maybe this still feels a little bit risky to a lot of companies, but it has this proven track record. Like it has some really amazing stuff that I just haven't found anywhere else. Even amazing projects like Akka, where they kind of took some of the same concepts of Erlang and re-implemented it into Java, and so that you could kind of have these functional reactive actors, and that was a huge boon to a lot of Java projects. But last time I played with it, the idea of like supervision trees and stuff still wasn't there. And that meant there's a bunch of little things you had to worry about and deal with on your own.
So Josh, I haven't heard you weigh in where you think it is.
Where I think it is in the hype cycle?
Or the adoption cycle.
Yeah, I said the upper end of early adopter.
That's right.
Yeah, I was going to say regarding supervision trees, I feel like that's an often underrepresented thing. And when people are looking at Elixir early, I don't think maybe you can appreciate how nice it is to have a very detailed ordering of dependencies that you're guaranteed are there. And that's a nicety.
Yeah. I was talking with a coworker. He's an intern at work yesterday. And we were talking about like supervisors, because what we were doing is we were setting up a supervisor to launch off dynamic tasks. And the idea, though, is that we were talking about like systemd and Docker and Kubernetes and all these things that people have created as ways of, doing health checks and monitoring the system. And when the whole thing crashes, bring it back up. And really, what they're trying to do is they're trying to re-implement an Erlang system. But what they're doing is like, okay, well, in order to do this well, we have to have lots of small microservices. And they'll each be monitored and restarted, but then we have to have a way for them to talk to each other. So let's put in a message bus. And now you got subscriptions, and you have protocols that you have to serialize, and you have to version the protocols. And you just have this incredible level of complexity. It's like, well, how do I develop the whole system? As a developer, can I run the whole system on my machine and see how it all works together? It's like, well, that gets pretty hard. And that's what they're trying to do. And with the Beam, we have that, and you can still have an Elixir microservice that hooks into an existing set of services, and that's totally valid. But you can have an entire system with all the little workers, and the messages get passed within the system, so you can even avoid network traffic. You can avoid serialization and protocol versioning, and then you can have like the supervisor that just monitors this one little piece, and when something goes wrong in that one little piece, just that one little bit gets restarted, and everything else goes on its happy way and was never bothered. It's like, it really is. I totally think that is it's like a superpower that the Beam has, and that the rest of, which kind of makes it hard, because you bring in people like, you can't always hire people who know Elixir, right? When you're hiring for a team. So you're bringing in people from potentially other communities, and they're like, well, this is how we solved it in these other communities. This is how we solve these problems. So like, why don't we bring in a message bus? Why don't we bring in all these other things? It's like, well, so you have to have somebody at the company who really understands Elixir and says, and can validate why that is a good decision or it is not needed for what you're trying to accomplish. So I don't know. It's part of my thought process when I think of hiring and being an advocate in your own company for bringing in change. So I don't know. Michael, I know you worked at a job where there were a number of services with a message bus of some kind, or message passing between the services. And you were able to introduce at the company, they introduced some Elixir services, right? What was that like?
Yeah, actually, that company used Protobuf for all messages between services, both on an event bus and also there was kind of direct synchronous messaging that would happen, kind of request response cycles. And getting back to your earlier point or what you mentioned about having versions of protocols and stuff, right? It was an interesting set of problems to solve. But honestly, I would at this point, I would love to hear somebody, maybe somebody from a company like AdRoll or a company like Discord have this conversation with someone from Bleacher Report. Because I know that, so for those who aren't aware, Bleacher Report very much just takes the design aesthetic of like, hey, it's fine to make a stateless Phoenix service. It's going to respond to certain kinds of requests. It's going to render some JSON back. That's great. You don't need to use all the fancy stateful supervision tree stuff other than just what's already there out of the box. That's a great solution. I implemented one service similar to that at my company, and it really was like it was pretty straightforward. It felt very much like building a Rails app, except that you didn't have extremely long garbage collection cycles from needing to clean up 8 gigabytes of slightly small strings that were copied together in various configurations. And IO lists saved the day so that, like out of the box, we had like 15x throughput and slightly lower latencies in small numbers of requests. And so it was just, to me, it was better in every way. I also built one service while I was there, which took the point of view of like, hey, let's do things kind of more holistically. Let's try to bring more of the dependencies inside. And so this system had to go pull data from a bunch of different external sources and kind of stitch it together. And previously, this had been done by storing data in Redis. And so you'd kind of like go fetch this thing, and then you'd go pull the thing back out of Redis and stitch them together. And we decided, hey, that's fine, but we can just do this in memory in Elixir and roll the system that did that. It was distributed, so there's 3 nodes, and they used a library that went over the top of Amnesia to make a write consistent in-memory store. So it was kind of like you had Redis, but the reads from it were incredibly fast. And it worked super well. It was crazy stable. It was a lot faster. And to me, it was a lot easier to reason about. There was no like, oh, this is how we serialize dates when they go into Redis, and this is how we unserialize them on the other side. And we just didn't do any of that. It was all in memory. It was all in the same place. But they were different OTP applications. One that was responsible for kind of maintaining that in-memory store and cleaning it up, and another one which was responsible for reaching out to this source of data and that source of data. And so you could, to your point, Mark, you could start up the whole thing and look at it like it was this little microcosm. You could open up Observer and like poke and prod at, here's all the things that are there. You could use mix xref to get a diagram of like who's calling who. And you could kind of roughly see the shape of like, oh, there's a bunch of little function calls that happen within this section of code. And then there's a few big ones that go over to this other OTP app that trigger that behavior. That kind of tooling was really nice compared to trying to solve that same problem with a bunch of stateless services, where if you wanted to know, well, who are the people who call this endpoint and do they care about this thing? You're like, maybe go search for the name of your endpoint in all the other repos in our company. It just becomes harder. There's very loose coupling at that point, and loose coupling can be a great thing. So, like I said, I would honestly love to hear this from people who have taken this idea further than I did. I only did one relatively small stateless thing, one small stateful thing and a couple of small stateless things. But I would love to hear from, again, like AdRoll or Discord or some of the other shops that are very much taking the stateful OTP approach to their own application design, and just hear them compare and contrast their experiences with someone who says, we don't need to do all that. We can just have a bunch of Docker containers running very simple Elixir applications.
I think a lot of it just comes down to the kind of problem you're trying to solve too. And like, is it inherently a stateful thing or not? And like, then if there is, if it is stateful, then there are a number of different ways you could solve it, like be it with Redis or something else, like with in-memory, caches or whatever within the beam. So, yeah.
Stateful stuff is hard, but easier with Elixir. And I've found the stateful things that I worked on to be more fun in the past couple of years. I don't know if that's a direct correlation or just coincidence.
I like that comment, Josh, because sometimes I've noticed that the projects that are most fun for me aren't necessarily, that doesn't correlate super well with profitability. Because sometimes I want the challenge, I want it to be interesting and kind of stretch me as an engineer. Whereas sometimes the best way just to make things super business, make things fun for the business, is just to have them be super boring and repeatable. But that's also not where you get leverage, right? Like the whole reason we're writing software is so that we don't have to do the same things over and over. And that's like, we always want to keep pulling on that lever, right?
Yeah, I feel like we're still in the phase of technology where there's still a lot of access databases that want a web, that need to be turned into a website. So,
oh no, that's so true. I bet. Oh, I haven't touched anything like that in so many years, though.
I recently worked on a tool that is essentially a very fancy version of an Excel spreadsheet, and everyone loves it. All of the people that use it think it's amazing. It's literally just a fancier version of Excel spreadsheet they already had access to. But anyway.
Yeah, speaking of like stateful stuff, like at work, we're currently exploring more with LiveView to see kind of like pushing the boundaries and seeing like how much of our application can make use of that, and how much does that make sense. And so we've been kind of pushing it out slowly into different parts and exploring that space. And it still is fairly early in LiveView. It's not even 1.0. So it's not entirely smooth. Like there are some little hiccups, or just like where we kind of need to think about it, or we're waiting, like or actually we've had a guy at work who's been submitting bug reports to the LiveView project, and they've been getting fixed. So it's like, it's still like, I'd say like we're in the innovator stage of that, right? Of adoption for that feature. But yeah, so I think it's exciting, and that is an interesting new way of dealing with stateful. But I really liked it was last week. James Edward Gray the second said how he loved the idea of he struggled with the idea of like, why does this stateless service, why does it forget everything about the customer or the user every time it's like, here comes a request, I have to build up this entire state, find out who they are, what they're doing, what's going on, and then move the peg one more level down, do a little bit of work, and then they come back with a second request, and I've forgotten everything, and I have to redo it all. Like LiveView, it's like you don't have that problem, right? It's like I at least know who I'm talking to and what they're in the middle of doing. So it's an interesting kind of different way of looking at it, and I'm excited to see how that makes sense. So I don't know, that's another little technology adoption lifecycle within Elixir and Phoenix.
Yeah, I actually loved that comment from James. By the way, that while we were recording that episode, there was a lot of me muting my microphone and squeeing like a little fangirl, talking to both Bruce and James. But I loved his comment because I think, going back to the earlier part of our conversation, the whole reason that I think any one of us goes through this cycle of language adoption or hype cycle at both the micro and macro scale, it almost always starts with like, man, there's this thing that's bugging me, or a better way that I can envision doing this that serves the needs of the people touching my software or my team's ability to deliver it. In some way, there's something to make this better. And he was talking about a product where there's kind of like this ongoing conversation between the user and the system before any decisions really got made. And I've worked on a few of those kinds of projects in the past, and I've even seen them structured in such a way that that the system just kind of keeps on taking in every user action as like an event, and it doesn't do any authentication or authorization or decision making until the very end, because breaking up the decision making into all these little spots was just such a pain. And I totally could understand from James's point of view why, hey, if we just need to like stitch together all these little small actions and make a decision all at once, I can actually have a process that just wraps around that. And it's not blocking anything else. It's not going to affect anybody's performance or concurrency issues, but it can just sit there and hold stuff in memory about how far I've gotten and what decisions I've made so far. And that means that you can now go back and implement things like flow control, or prompting the user to fix something right at the moment that they make a mistake. And so now what you've got is, this previous architecture where you kind of just optimistically said yes to everything until you finally did all those decisions at the end so that your code was some form of sane and didn't have bugs all over the place. But you've married that with the ability to respond to the user in a helpful way and create software that actually empowers that user to get their things done more quickly, more correctly. And that, to me, that feeling of when you find a tool that just matches the problem, the way that you have chosen to model the problem in your head now matches the tool so well. It's a magical, amazing feeling. And when you actually get to deploy it because your company was okay with adopting that tool or that technique, oh man, there's nothing better. That's got to be one of my favorite things in my entire career as an engineer, that whenever I can find that fit, it's the best.
That is so true. It is. For me, myself, you're speaking from my heart, brother. Amen. But I kind of feel like for me, it really comes down to, can I deliver something better, faster to my users to make, because I'm trying to make an impact, right? I at one point in my career, my coding was a job, and other times it's been I am actually trying to make a difference, either socially or within the team, within the company, or trying to make my users' lives better. And if I can use some piece of technology that lets me do that in a more effective way, in a faster way, in a way that's easier for me to maintain, that doesn't add all this load and complexity to the project, then I want that, right? And that's exactly what you're describing there. And because I was thinking, as you're kind of describing some of that, it's oh, well, one solution for that is just do it all in a JavaScript single page app where it's collecting up all of the intents of what we want to accomplish, and then we'll send it all off to the server. So then, but what you end up with is where you've split out all of your business logic, and you have to version your business logic in two different front ends, two different the back end versus the front end. Yeah, so it's an interesting topic. Yeah, but I think I've really enjoyed this fireside chat. I don't know, is there anything else you guys wanted to mention?
I would just mention, it's not Elixir specific, but if you find yourself in that situation, I have had success with using introspection facilities in the backend language so that it can pass up a data structure representing the validations or whatever to the front end, so that you don't actually have any of the business logic in the front end. It just gets the data structure that represents it from the back end. Anywho, so if you find yourself in that situation, there's a thought.
Yep, I'll plus one that. I think turning logic into data, and that way you can relocate where you execute that decision or where you check it to any point that makes most sense for your project and company. It's a great technique.
But it's hard.
Yeah. So I guess just coming back to the very opening topic, one of the thoughts I guess I wanted to kind of close out with was people who are coming to Elixir, they're coming maybe from coming from JavaScript or PHP, or they're different points in their career as a developer, as an engineer. It is an interesting time. We are still that early phase. This is, and so it might not be the easiest thing to find a job, to say, oh, I just want to find someone. And especially because I know there are people who say, I just want to kind of do on the job learning. I want to have someone else teach me. And that's, that's a valid way to learn. But I'd say we're still at that early enough phase that if you want that change, you kind of need to be the agent of change. So you need to be the one who's making an effort to learn on your own, because there aren't companies that are necessarily prepared to teach you, because they, if you're talking about to someone at your current company, you're having to convince the CTO or the VP of engineering or somebody to say that this is something worth making a bet on, because it's for them, it's a risk. Any technology decision is a risk, whether it's a risk to stay with something old that's tried and true and that's maybe kind of waning as a technology. It's a risk to leave Cobalt, right? It's a risk to make any kind of change. So you're having to be that advocate. You need to take the initiative to learn and to start kind of sharing your discovery and your excitement with other people around you. And we've been talking with lots of people as guests, talking about with books and conferences and online talks and lots of resources. I'm creating a course. You can check it out at thinkingelixir.com to help people in this process of learning and having something you can point to and share with somebody else that they can say, okay, now I get that thing from that conference talk. Thanks for sharing that. Or, let's have a lunch discussion. So what I just wanted to close out with is just saying, don't be disillusioned if you're not seeing the job opportunities right present in front of you. We're still at that early phase. It is picking up though, and it's an exciting time. So just enjoy the ride. It's going to be a good one. But I think that's probably it for our time. Let's move to picks.
Yay. I'll start. So we mentioned at the beginning, we were talking about languages. So I just wanted to share a link to PonyLang. I have not used Pony. I've watched it sort of from the fringes, but it's an interesting language. It's inspired by Erlang, but made for speed is my broad understanding of it. But I could be super wrong. I've liked reading posts about it and just kind of following along vaguely from a distance.
Michael, you want to go?
Yeah, 2 picks this week. So the first one is a talk by Brandon Hayes that was given at Mountain West Ruby Conf here in Utah. This is back, I think, in 2010. And it's called Surviving the Framework Hype Cycle. He talks about hype cycles, and he also talks about developer happiness, which is an interesting overlay. And a lot of what he's talking about here is if you are someone who wants to be an early adopter, or if you have that kind of personality, you might want to think about these kinds of jobs because they are much more amenable to that kind of a choice. And if you want to be an early adopter, maybe don't do these kinds of jobs because it's going to lead to a lot of pain. And I think that for me, I remember sitting in that audience and thinking, oh my gosh, like this was the talk I needed. So big thanks to Brandon Hayes for giving that and for talking through it, because it did help me make some kind of job decisions that I think have just led me to having less friction and more happiness. So a solid pick for me there. The other one is totally non-technical. I've recently been watching YouTube videos from a guy named Alex. He's a French guy. I have a friend who grew up in Dijon, and he calls him a free-range Frenchman. Which I didn't know what that means, but apparently it just is that he is very French in the way he speaks and acts. And he lives in Paris. He's kind of a chef / engineer. And that to me is really interesting, just to kind of hear people applying engineering principles to the process of making food. And again, to me, it kind of blurs the lines between engineering and creativity or artistic expression. And he embodies that in the world of kind of food. So anyway, I'll link to a video where he's talking about, he's trying to take a pan and make it more smooth and nonstick than a nonstick pan. And it gets all the way down to like polymerization issues of oil, and super interesting, fun stuff to watch. And I also just find him hilarious. So that's my second pick.
That's cool. Yes, Brandon Hayes. He was one of the guys that I met at some Ruby meetups back when I was, coming to Ruby in this community. So he's an awesome guy. So mine is This Erlang Life. It is a Tumblr blog. It is just funny Erlang Elixir kinds of things. I believe it's run by Fred Hibbert, but I can only say that because the graphic is the same graphic he uses for his other things. So I can't actually credit or blame him for it. So, but it's if you enjoy Elixir and Erlang, and tons of funny little GIFs and just something fun to check out and share with your friends. So that's it for me. All right. Well, if you would like to reach us, I'm at Brainlid.
I'm at Neuter.
And I'm Ries.
And we'd love to hear from you. And that's it for today. Thank you for listening, and we hope you'll join us next week on Elixir Mix.
Woohoo!
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with